Our next presenter is another supermodeler. Simon Horton has been offering a variety of modeling software for a while under his studies at SFU. Um, and he's going to present on that today. So thanks again for joining us, Simon, and over to you.
Thanks, Joe. I'll just take over here. There. Can you hear me and see me?
Looking good and sounding good, and your presentation's ready to go.
Okay, thank you. So I'm hoping today to talk a bit about some of the tricky forecasting situations we had this winter at Avalanche Canada involving persistent problems on the coast. This talk's going to be kind of a mix of a case study just on these situations on their own, and then also at the end talk about some of the research I've been doing on Snowpack modeling and how they helped in these situations. So do I have bars over my screen right now? No? Okay, I'll continue. First, I'd like to acknowledge the peoples whose traditional territories this work was done on. I also want to thank our collaborators on this project, including Pascal's group at the SFU Avalanche Research Program, Avalanche Canada, and our project collaborators who are helping with verification of the Snowpack models. Our research is funded by MyTax and the NSERC Industry Research Chair. And I'd also like to thank the supporters of Avalanche Canada, who include government partners, affiliations, program partners, sponsors, contributors, and collaborators. Most of the time after a big storm on the coast, it's pretty common to see conditions improve pretty quickly. New snow problems heal, and people can safely push into bigger terrain. But from time to time, we do see a persistent problem in these areas, and they can pose a number of tricky problems. One thing I've noticed over the past few years is that the initial onset of a persistent problem on the coast can catch people off guard. We sometimes see a spike in recreational accidents as people aren't expecting lingering weak layers after a stormy period. And also sometimes the public forecast doesn't fully anticipate and warn about touchy weak layers as they're not common to these areas. So through this talk, I'm hoping just to look at some of the examples from this past winter of persistent problems posing a challenge on the coast, show one possible tool to help with that in Snowpack models, and then maybe at the end hear from some practitioners who work on the coast to share any of their experiences they have with these types of situations. Throughout this talk, I'm going to use this time profile of snow depth at Pig Alley and Whistler to kind of highlight different periods throughout this past winter. And first, we'll talk about the weak layer that formed in early December. There was a widespread facet crust layer, and in some areas also some surface ore. And once buried, this layer or these layers posed a serious persistent slab problem in the sea to sky area, largely around Whistler, that lasted for about a month. Initially, as this layer was first buried, there were lots of reports of smaller size 1 to 2 avalanches and some pretty clear signs that there was a persistent weak layer in the snowpack. Throughout this talk, I'm going to show a bunch of photos that were shared through the Mountain Information Network, which was really valuable this year, and I credit the submitters in each photo. By December 28th, the primary weak layer was now about 80 centimeters deep. There had been some recent activity in the sea to sky area, but it had started to slow down. Both the public forecast and operators on the InfoX were listing a persistent slab problem, but they rated it as unlikely to possible with size 2s. This particular day turned out to be a rather pivotal one for this avalanche problem. There had just been a cold front that passed through, so it was a clear, cold day with about 30 centimeters of low-density snow. The avalanche danger was rated at moderate, low, and the primary concerns were instabilities in that new snow. And while there was a known persistent weak layer, that it wasn't considered terribly likely to trigger. However, on this day, there was a number of notable events, including this large snowmobile-triggered avalanche on Rainbow Mountain, some large naturals in the Whistler area, as well as this fatal accident north of Pemberton. And after the events on this day, it was clear that this weak layer wasn't your typical short-lived weakness on the coast, and that we were dealing with a problem that was going to persist a fair bit longer. And indeed, in the following weeks, we saw ongoing reports of large avalanches lasting into mid-January. These are some deeper slab releases in the Whistler backcountry in Cowboy Ridge. A second persistent weak layer formed a bit later in January. This was primarily a facet on crest layer. And it didn't form a really long-lasting persistent slab problem like the December layer. But over the first few weeks of February, it did result in some localized hotspots where there was a big flurry of avalanche activity and temporary heightened conditions. The first hotspot was in the North Shore Mountains, and where in the final week of January, there were lots of reports of human-triggered avalanches, all involving a facet on crest layer. And since this type of avalanche problem isn't that common in this area, and for a number of other factors, Avalanche Canada decided to issue a special public avalanche warning starting the weekend of January 30th and 31st. And over this period, we did see continued avalanche activity in the North Shore Mountains on this layer. During that weekend, on January 31st, there were also some notable avalanches that occurred on Vancouver Island. And it turned out that the snowpack structure there was quite similar to the North Shore Mountains. And the days following these events, the special public warning was extended to include Vancouver Island. By the following weekend, activity on the North Shore Mountains and likely Vancouver Island had subsided, but there was a big flurry of human-triggered avalanches in the Coquihalla area over a few days. These avalanches were a combination of both storm slab problems, but also some of them likely involved the same facet and crest layer that had just been observed on the coast in the prior week. So when it comes to preparing a public forecast, anticipating some of these persistent problems on the coast can be tricky to do a day in advance. Especially it seems on the coast where these types of problems are less common. Sometimes we're dealing with issues of data scarcity. We might not have field observations to know if and where a weak layer has formed near the surface. But quite often we might know about a weak layer, but have a fair bit of uncertainty about whether it's going to survive a coastal storm when it gets buried. The nature of weather on the coast is a lot of the storms come in wet, windy, fluctuating freezing levels, and quite often the snow that comes in will stick to any interface that it's burying. So it leaves us coming out of the storm uncertain whether or not we'll be dealing with a persistent avalanche problem. A common strategy we'll use in a forecast is to communicate some of the ideas of a stepping out mindset and stepping out with caution, with travel advice along the theme of gather information, investigate the bond of new snow to old crests, dial back your terrain if you see signs of instability. And while this is a generally good advice to give after a storm, it might not be strong enough messaging for these rare cases where we have a truly touchy persistent layer in the snowpack. And at these times, a more appropriate message would be along the lines of heightened avalanche danger and fully minimizing your exposure to avalanche terrain. But as I said, it's tricky to really dial exactly when these hotspots and persistent activity are going to happen on the coast. Just it seems to be roughly once, maybe twice per year in a region, and sometimes not at all. So one possible tool that could be helpful for this is some of the snowpack modeling work that we've been involved with between Avalanche Canada and SFU, where we're creating tools to help forecasters visualize the snowpack on a very broad regional scale. Past presentations, we've talked a bit more about how we do this. In essence, we're using past weather forecasts to reconstruct the snowpack and make predictions on the depths and distributions of critical avalanche layers. So I'll show what some of these visualizations looked like for these tricky periods this past winter. using profiles from roughly 100 different locations throughout the South Coast Mountains. And in particular, a few of these localized areas where there was avalanche activity. First, we'll look on January 31st. This is when the special public warning was issued, or in effect, in the North Shore Mountains, and when accidents were simultaneously occurring on Vancouver Island. This simulated profile here is representative of tree-lined terrain in the North Shore Mountains. It shows a 4-meter snowpack with about 60 centimeters of recent storm snow sitting above soft crust or soft weak layers on a hard crust. It's a pretty obvious sign of an unstable slab weak layer combination. Now we can look at the simulated profiles from some of the neighboring areas at the same day. We see the snowpack structure on Vancouver Island is quite similar, with a slab above a weak layer on a crust. Meanwhile, further inland in the Coquihalla and Whistler, we also see a weak layer above a crust, with just a small amount of soft snow above it. We can also look at this back on the map using the gridded view of all 100 simulated profiles in this area. And what we're looking at here is areas grouped by similar snowpack structure. Last year, Florian from SFU presented a statistical method to compare snow profiles. And we've been working on using that to group profiles based on the types of critical avalanche layers they have. So here on January 31st, we're looking at 3 different shades of blue, representing 3 different types of snowpacks that the models predicted on that day. The first area extends over Vancouver Island and some of the very coastal areas on the mainland. These areas were represented by this structure of a harder storm slab above a persistent weak layer. The next region was more in the Cascades, where there was less snow above this weak layer. The third cluster was the further north inland areas of the Sea to Sky and South Coast inland regions, where there was also less snow above this weak layer. So on this particular day, the models do a pretty good job of highlighting that you could expect a similar snowpack structure in the North Shore Mountains and Vancouver Island, which indeed was observed with avalanche activity this day. We can jump ahead to February 5th now, which was when activity started to take off in the Coquihalla area. And now if we look at these same 3 or 4 profiles, we can see the Coquihalla now has the most obvious unstable slab weak layer combination. Well, further inland, or sorry, not further inland, well, back on the North Shore, the upper snowpack had settled out thanks to a warmer, wet storm. If we go back to the map, we can see that these groups of similar snowpacks have moved around a bit. It now shows parts of Vancouver Island in the North Shore having a more settled upper snowpack. The Cascades, which include the Coquihalla and parts of Vancouver Island, have the more unstable structure. And these more northern inland regions do have a decent storm slab, but a less developed weak layer crust combination underneath it. So overall, over the lifespan of this late January facet crust layer, these snowpack model visualizations did a pretty effective job of highlighting when and where the right combination of a slab and weak layer would occur, and potentially could have been helpful to better anticipate where the next hotspot was going to be for avalanche activity on persistent layers. But this example is really kind of a best case scenario of working with a snowpack model tool like this, because overall over the winter, we experienced a mix of successes like this, but also false alarms and near misses. And that can be well highlighted if we go back to December 28th, where the persistent problem really took off in the Sea to Sky region. On this day, if we looked at all of the different profiles we had in that area, none of them are really showing a prominent persistent weak layer in the snowpack. And over the lifespan of this avalanche problem, the snowpack model tools weren't very helpful to our public forecasts. It's interesting to look at the reasons why this particular event was a miss. And from looking back, my best suspicion is it involves what happened shortly after the December 9th crest was buried. In the field, we saw about 10 to 20 centimeters of snow burying the crust. And then between December 10th and 13th, there was a period of clear, cold weather that was really favorable for forming facets above this crest. Now, at the same time, if we looked at our simulated snow profiles, they rely on weather forecasts. And during this period, the weather forecast called for 20 to 40 centimeters to fall on top of that crest. What this meant was that during this clear cold period, there were weaker temperature gradients and less facet development above the crest. Effectively, the models didn't pick up the formation of this weak layer and missed the subsequent notable avalanche problems that developed. This is a good example of some of the current work we're working on at SFU to correct these types of errors, both by incorporating weather observations and snowpack observations into these simulations. To wrap up, I'm interested to hear if anyone has any thoughts to share on their experiences or challenges anticipating the onset of persistent problems on the coast. Certainly, once you're out in the field, there can be obvious signs of these problems. But when it comes to a day out or before heading into the field after a storm, how well do we have a handle on whether a persistent weak layer has survived and will become reactive? This winter was also notable for Avalanche Canada increasing its use of snowpack modeling. It's been a work in progress, but this year there was a substantial uptake in bringing it into daily operations. In a large part, that was due to data sparsity in many regions, and that was one valuable application. But also some of these abilities to compare snowpacks within a region proved to be a helpful tool to extrapolate field observations. So the example I showed where we knew there was a problem on the North Shore Mountains, but less certainty about which neighboring areas were experiencing similar conditions. A snowpack modeling tool could really help extrapolate these. We also have this ongoing challenge of learning when to trust the models and how to incorporate them into our daily decision making. There certainly seem to be cases where they were really valuable and added extra insights into what the snowpacks were doing over the course of the winter. But then at the same time, we were also dealing with a number of false alarms and near misses. And it's going to be a gradual learning process to see how well this tools can perform in different situations and incorporating more research to improve their overall quality. With that, I'll thank you guys and happy to hear any thoughts or questions.
Great. Thanks, Simon. I think modeling is a challenging thing, and uptake from practitioners is also an interesting one in terms of how much they buy into the model. So I'll be curious if there's any questions from the crowd. Brent, I don't see any just yet. Do you?
I currently see no hands up on the floor, and that usually cues a hands up, but today it is not working. No, I have no hands up from the floor. Anybody got a question out there, folks? Looks like you did a good job of explaining, Simon.
All right.
Oh, we got a couple of hands from the coast.
Tim Haggerty, go ahead.
Hey, Simon, how's it going? Good presentation there.
Thanks, Tim.
Yeah, just one comment is more for the Avalanche Canada forecasting system. Since now everybody's kind of working from home anyways, is there any thoughts of going back to having people based out in those zones? I know we went back to a central forecasting unit in Revelstoke, but I think eyes in the field works a lot better than just voices over a phone.
Yeah, I think with the pandemic and people working remotely, Avalanche Canada is certainly reconsidering the pros and cons of different approaches of where forecasters are based, but at this point, it's still kind of an open discussion.
Thanks.
Not sure.
Yeah, we have another question from the floor from Mindy Brugman. Go ahead, Mindy.
Hi, that was a great talk. Look, it's really good to hear they're doing lots of snowpack modeling. There's a lot going on for the river runoff as well. My question was like, is there going to be some ongoing way to evaluate how well the snowpack models are actually doing? And then also any help you could say as what weather variables would really be needed to get to help you the most, like for a persistent weak layer, for example?
Yeah, good questions. By far, the most important input to get is the proper amount of snowfall.
Right.
Even for persistent weak layers, which often form during snow-free periods, getting the snowfall amounts helps figure out when slabs are forming above them, what kind of temperature gradients exist in the snowpack, and it's a really important part. So we've been doing some work collaborating with different groups who do work on measuring and predicting snowfall in the mountains, including the Environment Canada, snowpack modeling, or weather modelers, various weather station networks. And probably the first and easiest way to diagnose the performance of these models is comparing them with weather actuals. And in the previous talk that Stan gave, where we have some dashboards to look at general patterns in our weather station network, I think we'll be working on integrating that with the snowpack models to get some general indication of how well these are agreeing with weather observations.
Also, question is how useful would it be to say anomalous wind direction? I mean, wind direction often after the precipitous fall and that transports them, but something that would indicate anomalous weather to change your snowpack.
Wind is definitely a challenge, especially when looking at very big regional scales, because there's so many localized effects. And it's been a challenge from a modeling perspective to understand the patterns in snow transport driven by wind. That's partly due to that limitation. A lot of our current focus has been looking at snowpack features in sheltered terrain, primarily crests, facet on crests, and surface or layers. Wind is a challenge.
All right. Next question from the floor will be from Scott Flabel. Go ahead, Scott.
Hi, can you hear me? Hello?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah, thanks, Simon. Great presentation and super interesting. And I can't begin to imagine all the challenges that you have with public avalanche bulletins. But having been living and working on the coast I think I've been ski touring for over 40 years or something. I noticed when I was teaching avalanche courses in late November and December, it was super common to have facets on crest. I would say at least every other winter. And it's just a matter of time whether they go away quickly or not. And but my main comment is just I don't think we're doing anybody on the coast a favor by perpetuating the myth that the snowpack just stabilizes right away. You can go and ski anything, because there's a big rush and competition to get out to all the best lines, and a lot of the time it's not as stable as people would like. So I think that, you know, we've been saying that for decades, that on the coast stabilizes so quickly. Well, a lot of times it does, but a lot of times it doesn't. That's all. Thanks.
Yeah, good comment, Scott. And I think I just add the recent pattern in avalanche incidents on the coast kind of show that it's a common theme of people getting caught underestimating persistent slab conditions.
All right, our next question from the floor is from Rupert. Go ahead, Rupert.
Hi, Simon. Thanks very much for the presentation. It's very interesting. You can hear me okay?
Yep.
I spent a little bit of time on the coast at the very start of the winter, and you have a profile, I believe, up behind the I think it's called a Little Bear or Big Bear along the Coquihalla. That's where I noticed one when I was looking around at the resources for that area. And I found it in the early season very handy to look at to just follow the development of the snowfall there. And I think that it would be great to have more of those around the landscape, moving closer inland, further inland, and towards the region I forecast in Jasper. And perhaps there's an opportunity to partner with those areas where we have telemetry stations with snow stakes and precip gauges. So throwing that out there as a possibility to do the ground checking with some proximity to these weather stations.
That's great. Thanks, Rupert. And I think as kind of interest, curiosity, and the ability of these tools to help us with forecast and grow, we can start to expand these types of collaborations to verify and validate these models. I will comment, this past winter, we ran a research project in collaboration with the South Rockies Avalanche Canada field team and Fernie Alpine Resort to collect a bunch of verification data. And we're going to use that to test different methods of how we can run some correction routines and use that really as a test case, knowing that it's common for weather forecasts to be quite far off in the Fernie area. And depending what methods prove to be most effective, we could look at scaling this out in a bigger scale.
Awesome. That's really exciting. Thank you.
Yeah, it looks like we have no
Brent?
more questions from the floor.
Okay, well, Simon, I think you've provoked some thoughts. You may have struck a partnership on the fly. Oh, I see we have
and
a
as soon
last
as I
question from
said-
Dave McClung.
Yeah, go ahead, Dave. Oh, looks like he's gone.
What the Dave giveth, the Dave taketh away. Okay, Simon, well, thanks for that. I'm glad you might have struck a partnership in the middle of this, and I think we're all looking forward to stronger models to come. So much appreciated for your presentation today.
Thanks, Joe.